So as people get settled, I'll just reflect on the comments this morning, just a tiny bit, and I certainly won't be conclusionary. But it really is true that this is a very tough task that BOEM has before it, and I think a lot of the comments before lunch echoed the flavor of different advice coming its way, from everything around climate change being a driver to open and get wind energy in the water, to climate change being a driver to go slow, be careful, fisheries are changing, the oceans are changing, acidification. We need to be careful. Comments from slow down, again, don't go too fast, let's make sure we get it right, to we got to get moving now and we got to do even more out there. Some people saying broaden the areas, that you've trimmed it too much. Others saying, boy, we need to trim these back so we're diminishing the impacts. And then finally a flavor of we need to learn now. There's stuff we need to study better before we move forward. To others saying, yeah, there's things to know, but we can do that sort of incrementally as we go, adaptive management. So a lot of really important perspectives out there. We are in a moment of change on a lot of different levels, and I think that's what we're wrestling with and hearing here is we're not in a static world, and when there's change, that's going to have impacts. And so I just want to acknowledge that here. So we want to continue, though, with our hearing back from different folks around the tables here and shift to the states now. And so what I'd like to do is we'll hear first from New York State and then New Jersey. And again, the same two questions, which is, sort of what's your reaction to the draft wind energy areas? And then for the states, what's the update on each state's procurement plans as well? So at this point, I'll hand it off to New York State, and we'll hear from Doreen Harris, who is director from NYSERDA, and then we'll hear from Greg Lampman, who's program manager of environmental research with NYSERDA.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, Doreen Harris, Director of Large-Scale Renewables for NYSERDA. We're happy to be here today to build on the remarks from President Barton and Jared Snyder this morning. Again, talking about New York's view not only on the draft wind energy areas, which will provide, I think, some responsive maps that will be helpful to you in considering our views in response, but also to provide you with an update on our procurement, which is a very significant milestone toward the achievement of our clean energy standard and offshore wind goals. So the underpinning really of our work was the master plan that was released in January of this year. And you heard this morning how extensive that effort was on New York State's part in producing not only a seminal piece of work, but also a solid foundation upon which to build as we now advance these wind energy areas forward for New York and for New Jersey at large. The master plan really, again, took stock of offshore wind development from all perspectives and is something that we're building upon now. We don't consider the master plan an end, but rather a beginning, a milestone, of course, but really, again, setting forth the active achievement of our goals as a state. An important aspect of the master plan as it relates to today's discussion was a proposal that we made to BOEM in response and in building on the data that we had assembled as part of the master plan, that we can say really started this process for BOEM in identifying what are now draft wind energy areas. So back in October, a little over a year ago, we produced, in concert with the task force meeting, a map including an area that we called the area for consideration. The area for consideration really, again, took stock of all of the analysis that we had conducted as part of the master plan. They're all listed here, but let's say in all told, it's quite comprehensive. It takes into account the uses of the ocean and the impacts associated with offshore wind to identify areas that on balance we believed represented the best opportunity with the least risk for future offshore wind development. And we're pleased today to report out on how this area compares with the areas that BOEM has now advanced and to provide our feedback regarding the next steps that we believe BOEM should be taking. But as President Barton indicated, to achieve the scale that we are looking for, to achieve the cost reductions that we know can benefit our regional ratepayers, we need additional lease areas. And associated with the area for consideration, we made a request to BOEM that they expeditiously identify at least 4 new wind energy areas within the area for consideration suitable to site at least 3,200 megawatts of offshore wind. So this is, again, a part of a broader planning exercise that we undertook and now, again, is being built upon by BOEM. I think when you think about how we in New York are thinking about offshore wind, it's important to note that as we move forward, we are actively advancing our interactions with interested stakeholders. This morning, you heard that we have formed technical working groups. They are listed on the screen here: environmental, maritime, commercial fishing, and jobs and supply chain. They're led by various state agencies, but they include involved stakeholders so as to not only take account of their views, but to actively engage in a way that can inform our efforts moving forward. So these 4 groups are very active, they're growing, and we're really pleased to see it because, in fact, this is the foundation upon which we build our efforts, including our solicitation that was issued earlier in November. The interesting thing about the technical working groups is that they are not associated only with New York State stakeholders. In fact, we've intentionally expanded their reach to include interested stakeholders from other states, including New Jersey and others, because we recognize indeed that this is a regional resource that has impacts beyond our borders. So, with regard to the solicitation, we are certainly very excited to have issued New York's first solicitation for 800 megawatts or more of offshore wind. Again, the interesting aspect of this effort is that indeed it is a collaboration between federal and state parties. Obviously, federal parties work predominantly on leasing, but the lease is not the end, it's just the beginning. Because in reality, the state picks up when the lease is issued and begins to procure energy from that particular area or others. So the solicitation is groundbreaking in many ways, obviously in the commitment from the state to procure offshore wind, but relevant to the discussions today is the inclusion of specific requirements manifest through our technical working groups to include provisions within the RFP that are quite relevant and quite important as we think about the state's role in advancing these projects after the lease is issued. So in fact, any winning proposer in response to this RFP will be required to not only submit environmental and fishing mitigation plans, but also to develop those in concert with the technical working group and to evolve over time, essentially as these projects are developed and operate. Not only do they have to participate in the technical working groups, but they also have to consult with New York State agencies as their projects are developed. It's also important to us that the data from these projects be made available to the public, so there will be a requirement in the associated agreements that the environmental data, again, is made public after it is collected. And also, related to the visual impact that I know Matt brought up this morning, there is a requirement that the awarded projects use lighting controls to minimize nighttime visibility. So all told, the word comprehensive is really the word you need to use when you think about this solicitation. It's seeking cost-effective renewables for the state, no doubt, but it's seeking to do so in a responsible manner and is effectuated through the agreement itself. So now we get to the space. And the space is really, I know, the topic of the day. So I thought I'd start by providing some context upon which we can build throughout this presentation. So in purple lines on the map, you can see the area for consideration, again, the area that New York advanced last October. And then in green, you see the primary and secondary recommendations from BOEM for their draft wind energy areas. And then to our east, you see the areas that either have been leased off of New England or are about to be leased next month through the auction that BOEM is planning in that region. Of course, you see the existing lease areas by Equinor, US Wind, and Ørsted off the New York and New Jersey coasts as well. So sort of thinking about this from the perspective of the overlap first between the BOEM draft wind energy areas and the area for consideration, you can see that there actually is good overlap between the two, but not perfect overlap. My colleague Greg will describe, the particular areas that BOEM has advanced and our feedback, basically piece by piece regarding the areas that BOEM has advanced. So with the undercurrent really of this focus that New York has taken regarding responsible development that is considering all stakeholder input, I'd really like to pivot and think about these areas from a commercial perspective here today. And this is really obviously cognizant of the fact that ultimately we are looking to build projects in this area, and we're looking to do so in a manner that obviously minimizes conflict, but also does so at least cost to our ratepayers as well. So first of all, from the regional context perspective, as was mentioned this morning, between New York and New Jersey, we have approaching 6,000 megawatts of demand for offshore wind, the largest by far in the nation. But there clearly is a relative shortage of lease areas upon which we can rely for offshore wind development. To our east, after these leases are issued in Massachusetts, there'll be over 900,000 acres of leased area for offshore wind development, whereas the New York, New Jersey area has currently has less than half of that area available for leasing. So clearly, to ensure that our needs are met collectively in a cost-effective manner, we believe that BOEM's areas can meet that need. Should minimal conflicts be identified and minimal areas be removed really through these subsequent processes that Luke described will occur over the next year or so. We believe that New York's work, again, provides a solid foundation upon which to build such that there should not be a need for significant cuts to the areas that New York will be proposing shortly in Greg's presentation. But it's important to recognize that to meet our collective demand, we really are looking, again, for a robust supply of lease areas upon which to draw. And the real goal here is to create an efficient, buildable, and competitive environment for offshore wind development. And to do that, we need, again, these additional areas. We need a concentration of areas as well upon which to build. So, building on that concept, when one thinks about offshore wind development, it's important to think about scale. So clearly, New York and New Jersey have created an opportunity for significant scale to be achieved in the industry toward the achievement of our goals. But what BOEM has prepared in some cases are areas, as Luke identified this morning, that are quite small. Particularly the fairways north and south areas that are advancing through these draft wind energy areas are capable of siting 1 to 200 megawatts of offshore wind, whereas the areas in Hudson North and South could cite 800 megawatt lease areas or greater. So obviously there's a pretty significant difference in scale between those two areas. As we'll be describing in a bit, New York had removed the areas from fairways north and south in its area for consideration, and we will continue to advance that recommendation going forward. I'd like to introduce, though, the concept of cost effectiveness, and there is indeed a significant diseconomy of scale with smaller projects. In fact, we see this in the most recent auctions coming out of Europe and even here in the US, where on average, the new areas that are being auctioned and awarded are around 600 megawatts. The Vineyard Wind area obviously was 800 megawatts. It's clear, and in fact significantly clear, that on a unitized basis, larger projects have better ratepayer value. And the reason for that is the costs are spread, of course, across a larger project for the capital expenditures, the development expenditures, and the operating expenditures. But further, when we look at these areas, we recognize that when you look at an area as being developable, you look at the wind speed, you look at the water depth, you look at the seabed conditions, and you look at the distance from shore from the perspective not only of visual impacts, but notable to my discussion today, the cost of transmission. And so when we look at these areas, clearly they are significantly more distant from shore than some areas, but the cost of transmission for a larger project can be spread, again, over a larger amount of CapEx, therefore really minimizing the unit cost for ratepayers. So building on this, we looked at the relative project economics of a 100 megawatt project in the Fairways North and South areas versus an 800 megawatt project in the Hudson North and South areas. And really, it's important to note that the levelized cost of energy, that's the unit of measure that is used in project development to look at the unit cost of a unit of energy. It's significantly less for an 800 megawatt project than a 100 megawatt project. In fact, 45% less on average. So clearly, we know that larger projects improve economies of scale, but further, the proportion of transmission costs it increases significantly for a smaller project. And it would increase even more if we considered the Fairways projects interconnecting into the New York City region, where the transmission distance would be even greater. So again, as a state, we recognize the importance of scale. As a region, we recognize the importance of scale. And I think as you hear further from my colleague, Greg, you'll see how this has come forth in the feedback that we are providing to BOEM today. So with that, I'll transition it to Greg to go through the areas that BOEM has produced, and of course, leave time for your questions as well.
Thank you, Doreen. When we first began this process of working in the offshore space to try to identify areas that present least conflict and the greatest opportunities for offshore development, we started with an area that ran from the coast of Long Island out to the continental break, and it was comprised of about 16,700 square miles of space. Through a process similar to what BOEM has used, we used a similar process to what BOEM has used and refined that space, considering the technical limitations of offshore wind energy development, considering relative risk with other ocean users, considering fixed resources, and a host of other topics that Doreen pointed out. And we narrowed it down to basically the call area, which is about 2,000 square miles. Through this process, BOEM has further refined that to draft wind energy areas, which encompass approximately 1,200 square miles. So that is about 7% of where we originally started with opportunities for development. It's a little disingenuous because there are technical limitations here and a bunch of other things, but I think it suggests that the limited area that's come out of this BOEM process is really important. And it's important for us to make sure that those sites are developed in a way that is most effective achieving goals to minimize future conflicts with offshore development. So if these are, as we believe and as BOEM believes, the areas that present the least conflicts, then it's incumbent upon us to try to move forward in a way that maximizes the benefit of those areas. The feedback I'm going to give you today is based in part on what we came out with in the area for consideration. It considers a whole host of topics that Doreen listed. They're also listed in the BOEM presentation. In addition, we've been gathering stakeholder feedback. And for an example of that is our Fisheries Technical Working Group. We've organized this Fisheries Technical Working Group and have spent, I say we, DEC in particular, have spent a lot of time reaching out to those groups to try to get feedback from them. I'm not going to try to present the positions of the individuals in that group, or we think of commercial fishing as a group, but in fact they're made up of different gear types and different economic models. So what I'm going to do is try to present some of what they reflected to us in that process, but also reinforce some of the other things that we know about these areas. I also do want to note that our Fishing Technical Working Group is comprised of not just New York State, but also Long Island and Massachusetts and New Jersey fishermen. In fact, New York is a minority on that group when it comes to commercial fishing. So we've taken a regional approach to this process from the beginning, and we continue to do that. So the first sites I want to mention are the ones Doreen was talking about. These are the fairway sites. Through our process for the area for consideration, we recognize that these sites are heavily conflicted with commercial fishing in a variety of gear types. There are also some conflicts with co-location with the shipping channels. The expectation is that as this process evolves, we would expect to see these sites further reduced in size, making them even less cost effective. As such, the state has recommended that these be removed from further consideration as wind energy areas. In doing so, we can move on to what we really need, which are large contiguous tracts that we can use for development in an efficient and cost-effective way. Another area that was outside of our area for consideration is the one identified here. This site was not included in the area for consideration, primarily for reasons of illustrating a setback from adjacent wind energy areas. So we included this as a setback from the Empire Wind site, to allow for wake effects and other issues between development areas. In looking at this process now, and we're in agreement with BOEM that this is probably an area that presents least risk, and as a result, it should be considered as a wind energy area. The only consideration we would add to that is that the outline of the southeastern edge of this is rather jagged. That produces an inefficient project site. It's complicated for developers to work with these large jagged edges. It's complicated for fishermen to understand where the edge of that is. It's complicated for navigation to work around it. So we would suggest filling that in and rounding it off to make a more consistent site. And I'll talk more about that in a few moments. Another area outside of our area for consideration are highlighted here. And we've gotten a lot of feedback from fishermen about the relative risks. You heard some of that this morning, particularly this area here and this area down here. And some of the fishermen would probably draw these circles larger, but in particular, these areas are unique in that first, they're used a lot for fishing, and also they're adjacent to the Hudson Shelf Valley. The Hudson Shelf Valley is a highly productive area. It has some unique resources and habitats, which is actually why it's probably good for fishing. And so we're recommending that we stay back from this area, back toward the area of consideration, and also recognize that as shipping comes out, and it was part of Luke's talk, they try to turn this corner. And so you can have multiple benefits of taking these off the map. And so we're suggesting that BOEM seriously consider this space and consider removing it from the area for consideration going forward. Moving on to a conversation about how these primary and secondary areas are set up. So first, we appreciate the fact that BOEM presented these areas both as primary and secondary areas. I think it provides greater granularity and understanding of what their thinking is and gives you a better understanding of what the relative risks are across the space. Additionally, providing draft areas is very helpful so we can have this conversation about them before they become finalized. It's not clear what the process would be in terms of primary and secondary areas going forward. There's been some assumptions that maybe BOEM would be leasing primary areas first and secondary areas perhaps later. And what we want to do is just put forth an economic evaluation of what that would mean for development going forward. So as you can see here, we tried to divide this up. These are just indicative areas of how this could be laid out, but we tried to divide this up in a way that these sites would be considered cost-effective or more or competitive and cost-effective. And what you end up with, if you think of primary areas being leased separately from secondary areas, is you end up with some rather unusual shapes in development sites. You end up with dog legs that run off to the side. You actually end up here with an area that is islanded that no one would use. We end up with, as I gave the example before, jagged edges over here. And the developer in this site is really going to want to know what's happening in adjacent sites to understand the relative risk to their site from wake effect. And so our suggestion would be that by taking these areas through this primary and secondary process is really great up till this point. And moving forward, it's important that we transition to including them within a wind energy area as a whole, so that sites can be designed to maximize the benefits, the competition, and reduce cost. So the way we design maximum sites for optimal sites for development is we need to consider the target capacity of 800 megawatts. Project sites are most cost effective when they come close to 800 megawatts. It is possible to have viable projects smaller than that, but they really should be larger than 400 megawatts to be truly cost effective. We also want to avoid those irregular shapes. It results in having to run wires and inter-array connections in lots of different directions, which add costs. It adds perhaps cable crossings, which are another risk to fishing. And so having really regular shaped sites that can be designed well is important. We've used, and you've seen this packing factor of 0.01 megawatts per acre. It's been bounced around this morning a little bit. I'm going to bring it up again. It's a rather conservative estimate of the number of megawatts you can fit within a site, but it's really a good number to use for design. What it allows after leasing is consideration of other things. So we can work with spacing, for example, to understand, to allow additional fishing access within the space. It can be used for buffers between sites to limit the wake effects. It can be considered for transit lanes. And I bring up transit lanes specifically because of some of the challenges that are going on in New England. Our suggestion would be to identify transit lanes for commercial fishing earlier in this process and use them for multiple benefits. So we could identify transit lanes that would satisfy the needs of commercial fishing and other maritime users and use those to buffer wake effects between project sites. These are things that could be considered earlier in the process to avoid conflicts down the road. Now, through the Fishing Technical Working Group, we're actually going to be working to develop recommendations or options for BOEM's consideration on the transit lane front. Another thing we're going to try to be doing is to develop an understanding of what restricts access to fishermen within a wind energy area. We believe that wind energy areas or wind energy and fishing can exist, commercially coexist, both within the region, but also within individual spaces. So understanding what constrains fishing access by gear type to a project site is really important. We want to keep fishermen fishing. And so by having a packing factor of 0.01, it gives us some flexibility around the spacing between the individual turbines and a variety of other things. So we think that's an important number to work with. And additionally, we say oops, giving away the show. We say in Hudson South, we need to define projects in a way that are cost effective or competitive. So designing setting up your target areas at 800 megawatts, giving uniform shapes are really good for building projects that are cost effective. We also want to make sure that developers are in competition with each other. This brings down costs. There have been some comments today about developers making excess money. Well, really the folks who are going to be picking up the tab on this in the end is going to be the ratepayers. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure that the cost to develop projects is as low as it can be, and that competition is sufficient to drive that price down for further protecting ratepayers. In order to work with competition, we need to understand wind speeds, water depths, wake effects, and distance from shore. They're the 4 primary drivers. And so in laying out lease areas, it's really important that these things are considered in that process. And here's just an example of an indicative layout that considers that. You can see the shapes are a lot more regular, and by leasing them all in one shot, you'd be able to, a developer in this area would know that a developer would be leasing down here, and down here, and would better understand which project site they should be trying to procure. So in summary, our suggestion today, our recommendation to BOEM is first to remove the areas in fairways north and fairways south. They're not in great demand, or they're not a very cost-effective due to their size. Even combining them isn't going to help that to a great degree. And they're a bit of a distraction from the real areas we need to try to accomplish the goals of renewable energy development in the space. We think you ought to really consider discussing in more detail with stakeholders and look at the data associated with those areas that I notified on Hudson North and Hudson South. We believe they present some of the highest risk. There are highest conflict, and there are also areas that the developers identified as not being terribly useful. Not a single developer identified that area as a place they wanted to be. So thinking about the cost, thinking about the demand, and thinking about the risk, we think those sites are also problematic. We'd like to see BOEM convert all of the remaining primary, secondary areas into a wind energy area and begin the process of laying out lease areas within them in a way that considers the best use of the space, maximizing competition, minimizing development costs. And we also think there are some things that should be figured into this before the leasing is done, which includes transit for fishing and other maritime uses in the space. So there's some things that should be worked out before this leasing process. And finally, we want to have to BOEM lease the acreage in New York and New Jersey that should be sufficient to competitively meet the region's nation-leading demand. So we'd like to see all of this converted and be leased in late 2019. And that's it. Thank you.
All right. That was great. Thank you. That was very thoughtful and clear, and gives, I think, the task force and the audience a lot to chew on. I do want to get to New Jersey, but let me just see if there's one or two quick clarifying questions from task force members. Anybody have anything? Okay. If not, thank you both very much. That was great. So at this point, what I would like to do is turn the mic over to Anne Marie McShay, who is an offshore wind program administrator with the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, who can, again, share where what New Jersey's thinking is around its procurement plans and as well reaction to draft wind energy areas.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anne Marie McShay. I'm the offshore wind program administrator for the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, as well as I'm joined by my colleagues at the BPU, the DEP, and the Governor's Office, as well as our team of research scientists from the Rutgers University RU Cool Lab, who have been part of this process with New Jersey for nearly 10 years now. For 10 years, we've been engaged with BOEM and working on these issues, engaged with stakeholders, and trying to resolve a lot of the issues that have been brought up today about what is the right scale, what are the right perimeters for lease areas, and how does that factor into ultimately a competitive solicitation? So today what I'm going to share with you is our approach to a solicitation, as well as where we are currently, and then give you some response to the BOEM proposed wind energy areas. Honestly, we are here today listening as much as providing input into the process. We feel strongly that it requires continued deliberation and analysis, and we are still in the process of doing that, understanding that we've only just received the wind energy areas about 2 weeks ago. So. So under Governor Murphy, New Jersey has committed to 3,500 megawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030. This is the largest commitment of any state, and that's important to understand, that scale. That defines everything about how we move forward. To meet this goal, Governor Murphy has called upon the BPU and our sister agencies to do all that is necessary to implement OWIDA, which is the Offshore Wind Economic Development Act of 2010, and to proceed with an initial solicitation of 1,100 megawatts. This is the largest solicitation to date by any single state. The BPU recently announced an open solicitation window with bids due December 28th, 2018. And this just gives you an overview of the current lease area, which is supporting our current solicitation, and potential future lease area incorporating the proposed call areas. It's larger than the wind energy areas currently proposed, but it just gives you a point of comparison. New Jersey, fortunately, currently has access to over 500,000 acres of current lease area. If you look at the diagram on the right, it depicts the current BOEM leases, from which projects could interconnect to New Jersey and thus bid into a competitive solicitation for ORECs. These leases include the Equinor lease, the U.S. wind and ocean wind leases directly off the coast of New Jersey, and the Garden State offshore energy lease off the coast of Delaware and Cape May. Together, these leases comprise of those 500,000 acres I mentioned. And based on BOEM's metric of 0.01 megawatts per acre, this could support about 5 gigawatts of capacity. But depending on turbine selection, capacity factors, buffer zones, and layout, these could support more or less than that. However, there are many factors, as our friends at NYSERDA shared with us, other than acreage, that must be considered, including the fact that not all these lease areas shown may be suitable for development or available for New Jersey. Other states, including New York, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, will be drawing from these lease areas. So we're now looking at much more of a regional market for development. And I think in developing these lease areas, we have to consider that regional market and how that regional market is going to evolve, not just in context to a current solicitation or 1 and 2 years, but solicitations over a period of time of up to 10 years. So when you look at with the additional proposed wind energy areas as currently proposed by BOEM, and specifically the inclusion of Hudson South, you're looking at approximately 800,000 acres or 8 gigawatts of capacity that could be developed and supported. But essentially, the New York Bight proposed leases positively support New Jersey's offshore wind goals, as well as our solicitation schedule. This is probably the most important slide in my deck today, in that it gives you an idea of both, It gives you an idea of both the scale of development and solicitation, as well as the timeline for solicitation. As I mentioned, we are currently in the process of procuring 1,100 megawatts. That window closes December 28th. Under Governor Murphy recently called for 2 additional solicitations of 1,200 megawatts each in 2020 and 2022. And together, this would ensure that we meet our goal of 3,500 megawatts by 2030. But if you look at this solicitation schedule, it aligns well with BOEM's planned lease auction in first quarter of 2020. That would allow that lease auction to occur, and then New Jersey to move forward with its solicitation. And it's important, it really is important that that happen prior to the solicitation, because that will ensure sufficient competition and actually robust competition from throughout the region. And similar, as you heard from NYSERDA, I'm sorry, I just have to. Similar, as you heard from NYSERDA, New Jersey considers the scale of lease areas as important as the number of leases to ensure both competition and sufficient economies of scale to drive down costs and OREC price. In developing our initial leases that are about 10 nautical miles off the coast, and I didn't even touch it that time, when our initial leases that were developed compromise about 344,000 acres, the 2 leases directly off the coast of New Jersey. They're about 10 nautical miles out to 20 nautical miles. And those were developed in consultation with BOEM in consideration of our ecological baseline assessment, which was performed by the DEP in advance of any leases being delineated, and in consideration of multiple uses, but also in consideration to the requirements under OWIDA to provide net economic benefits. And that's important because we worked with our team of researchers and scientists to look at that wind resource and understand the scale that would be necessary to achieve that threshold of net economic benefits. And that's why the leases were scaled to accommodate at a minimum 1,000 megawatts each, or actually 1,100 megawatts, which was the minimum requirement under OWIDA at the time. And currently, if you look at our current solicitation, we are soliciting anywhere from 300 to 1,100 megawatts. So ideally, those lease areas could accommodate that 1,100 megawatts, and that there are multiple leases that could deliver that scale is also important in terms of competition and driving down price. Also of note in our solicitation is a requirement for the net economic and environmental benefits. And if you look at the actual criteria by which solicitations would be evaluated, it includes provisions for both environmental protection plans and an economic development plan. So that lease, as it's delineated, supports the provision for those benefits being delivered. Currently, under the direction of Governor Murphy, as part of Executive Order number 8, he's also directed the BPU, in conjunction with our sister agencies, to develop an offshore wind strategic plan to focus on the critical components of offshore wind development, including achieving scale to reduce cost, job growth, supply chain businesses, workforce development, data collection, and the appropriate siting of facilities. So we're a step behind NYSERDA in this respect in terms of completing a strategic plan, but we think this is important to the process, particularly as we move from 1,100 megawatts in this current solicitation to the full 3,500 megawatts. So today we're asked to respond to the proposed wind energy areas. And I think overall the wind energy areas have been, we appreciate that BOEM was responsive to our comments and has removed areas of, was responsive to our comments and removed areas of direct conflict, as seen with the vessel navigation and just in context to those transportation corridors. But there are other conflicts that still need to be resolved, and especially when we consider NYSERDA is seeking up to, there are additional conflicts, especially when you consider that Hudson South has become the primary area of interest. And it's not just one lease area, but 4 lease areas at a scale of 800 megawatts each. That's a substantial area that will involve the primary area as well as the secondary area. And it's important for New Jersey to understand how that may impact not just overall fisheries, but species-specific impacts. And so we would like to, an opportunity to further consider not only those impacts, but also mitigation measures that could be incorporated along the way. And these are really something that BOEM has indicated is something that would be part of the leasing process itself and the COP development process, but we feel that we should be able to identify those provisions now as leases are being established and delineated. So our primary response is, while we're very supportive of the timeline, the establishment of additional leases, we would like additional time to understand relative impacts in the Hudson South area. Again, the Hudson South area, as proposed, the primary area is about 200,000 acres. That is not sufficient to support what NYSERDA is proposing in terms of the 4 lease areas for 800 megawatts each. If you used New Jersey's scale of development at 1,000 megawatts minimum, that would maybe be 2 lease areas. So we would definitely need to look at not only the primary lease areas, but the secondary lease areas and potential impacts. In terms of analysis, DEP would like additional time to also look at the bathymetric data to determine species-specific preferences and potential impacts, as well as in this process get further stakeholder input, as New Jersey stakeholders will likely be disproportionately impacted by the focus on Hudson South. Although we do see this as a opportunity to reach our goals and the goal of 3,500 megawatts by 2030. So do we want to take
If we've got a couple of minutes, if there's a question or two for Emery. Any task force members? Any questions for New Jersey on its procurement or its comments on the wind energy areas? No? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So at this point, just give me 1 second here. All right, so I've mentioned a number of times today already that we want to break you into small groups, and the reason, we've heard a lot from when we first got together through this last presentation, a lot of reactions to the draft wind energy areas, a lot more information on how they're being used, a lot around questions from some of the presenters themselves about analyses they haven't gotten to do, or information and studies that are happening right now from Department of Defense, trying to get a better sense from their sort of commander level folks on some of these wind energy areas, to the Coast Guard, which is still looking at its fairways piece of work there. So, there's a lot that's been raised, a lot of different issues from the stakeholders themselves during the public input. And we want to get you into small groups and get your feedback on 3 specific questions. One is, what new information did you hear today that informs your perspectives on a preferred configuration of offshore wind energy areas? So what'd you learn? And did it affect what you heard? And given the perspectives that you've heard today, what changes to the draft wind energy areas would you want BOEM to be considering that would have the potential to minimize sort of the inevitable user conflicts that we know are out there, but while still providing areas that are feasible for development and economically feasible development? Another way to think about that question, or an additional way to think about that, is did BOEM get that primary-secondary split right? Do you look at the primary areas and see some that maybe actually are secondary, or are some of those secondary not characterized appropriately? That's the kind of feedback that would be very helpful to hear. And then thirdly, are there additional information needs that would be helpful in identifying these areas that minimize user conflicts? And as you think about that, I would also think about that in terms of near-term information needs, like what do you really need to know, or what should BOEM really be looking at, as it's moving from draft wind energy areas to final wind energy areas? What new pieces of information or additional pieces of information should they be thinking about and looking at and getting their hands on, versus lots of other information that would be good and important, but perhaps rolls beyond the wind energy area delineation into latter phases? So those are the 3 questions we'd like you to think about. Over lunch, as I was walking back in, one of the members of the audience said, "So are we searching for consensus here?" And it was a good question, and the answer is no. I think, as you know, this is not a consensus-seeking body. You are all here to give your individual advice, but we think that by getting together in smaller groups, reflecting on these presentations and talking about these questions, we can sort of bubble up to the surface sort of what seems really important, the pieces that you want BOEM to be thinking about. So that's our aspiration for doing this. So how we will go about this is in a minute or two, I'm going to ask you to count off from 1 to 6. And you have only one job after you count off. Remember the number that you counted. It's just one number you'll have to remember. And yes, we are trying to deliberately mix you up. We have noticed that people tend to sit with the people they know and they work with. And that is really good for one type of discussion, but we want a discussion where we're kind of pulling you all together and chewing on all this input across the sort of different perspectives that you share. To support the dialogue, a couple of things. We will have a BOEM staffer will be at each table, and they will be there not to eavesdrop, but to take notes. As I mentioned, we, CBI, will be preparing a summary based on these discussions, and the notes that they give us will ensure that your conversations are reflected and captured, and they can benefit from that. They're also there to help you stay on track, make sure that everyone's getting to weigh in and we're covering the questions we want you to cover. There's also the materials on the table, the maps, the slide decks, and you should definitely feel free to draw on all of that as you get in the conversation. We'll have about 10, 12 minutes, maybe 15 for each of these 3 questions. So it'll be brisk, but I think if we all just have a focused conversation across the 5, 6 tables, I think we'll get a lot of good feedback. When we're done, you can stay in your tables with your numbers. You can get back to your original seats. Don't care about that. But we will want you to report back just some key themes. We don't have the time to hear every single thing that was said. And I don't think that would be a great use of our time, but it will be very helpful if one person at each table would volunteer to just share some of the key themes that emerged, or sort of the new ideas that emerged. We would really love it if it was a task force member who would do it. And so we'll ask you to maybe just self-select. The fallback will be one of the BOEM folks at the table will do it, but we really hope that's not the way it goes. Audience members, what do you do during this period of time, which will be only 40 minutes, so it's not that long. But we have several ideas for you to think about. Number one is you can play this game too. The 3 questions will be up here. Absolutely feel free to pull together into small groups, talk about these questions, come up with your perspectives, and then when we get to the public input section, we would love to hear your thoughts on this. So thought one is please, engage these questions, think about them, and share with us during the public input portion later. Second is some BOEM staff will be at the back at the posters, so if you want to have a more focused conversation with BOEM, understand some of the issues that come up, or just share your perspectives, definitely an opportunity to do that as well. Thirdly, obviously you can network among yourselves. There's lots of interesting people out there. Talk to someone you don't know. Share your ideas. Do some networking. And lastly, there's a whole city outside if you want to, just kill some time. You can't get too far, but there's plenty of interesting stuff within a few blocks. So that's the game plan here. So at this point, what I would like to do is, and the tables are 1, 2, 3. I think you guys are 4. Do you have a 4? Where's number 5, 6? So it's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you're going to go to whichever table your number corresponds with, and you're going to figure that out now because we're going to count 1 through 6. BOEM folks who are at the tables, do not play. You're not going to count off here. You're going to be at the tables taking notes. So let's start over here with our Coast Guard representative. DoD. Go ahead. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Back table. Oh, Mike. 4. After 6, go back to 1. Go ahead. Okay, everyone got a number? All right, and audience members, we will debrief this at 3:20. So if you're back by 3:20, everyone else get your tables, and I will put the questions up here. All right, if we can get going again here. Folks in the back, if you can come and find your seats, please. That would be great. If the folks gathered around Brian and David can come back here. Oh, fisheries people in the back. Okay, so what I would love to do, we've got a couple people running mics. Maggie and Stephen, you're going to help with a mic? So we're just going to really try to hop quickly from table to table. We'll take it question by question. we are not looking for a giant debrief on every question, but really just a couple of key things that came up at your table on each one of them. And then we'll just move from table to table and ask each ones to just add something new that was there. We don't need to hear the whole list if you covered the same thing. So first question, what new information did you hear today that informs your perspectives on a preferred configuration of offshore wind energy area? So this table, a couple of things. What came up in that when you asked that question?
The new DoD areas.
Okay, great. What else?
The Coast Guard potential transit lanes and the new analyses of some of the fisheries data.
Can you be a bit more specific on the last one?
There seems to be some data out there that presents not a clear idea of where certain fisheries are doing. Looks like they're declining, but that might just be how the information was analyzed.
So it's the lack of clarity in that?
Yeah.
Is that the issue? It's just sort of the uncertainty?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Great, let's hop to another table. Any table that's got a microphone? Go, yeah. Give it to one of them. Again, sort of what new info was learned came up in your conversation?
I think there was somewhat similarly how the fairways would be laid out and how that could affect issues going forward.
Okay.
There was also some, I guess, new information that it seemed like most of the areas were concentrated in the western side of the call areas. And anything else?
And when you said that last thing, is that in terms of the draft areas are concentrated there, or the sort of the intention that
No,
the conversation
the
was sort
draft
of
areas
focusing
within
there?
the call areas, so Hudson North and South versus fairways, I
Got
think
it.
is the issue there. And then there was I guess questions about whether areas were removed for visual purposes, visual impacts. Yeah.
Okay, so, and then the question of have visual impacts been considered? Sufficient? Or overly, okay. Let's use the word appropriately. It covers everything. Great. Next table, other pieces.
Hello. Didn't know if you left it on. It's a good thing I didn't talk while I was doing this. So we, in addition to this, some of this being new for the, to put another check mark for the Coast Guard transit lanes.
Yep.
We talked a little bit. Oh wait, this is all about new information. Sorry, I've got my notes a little bit. But generally, we got a kind of glimpse into BOEM prioritization. Okay. So on the winnowing, we could see there was, fishing areas were removed or transit lanes were removed. So it was kind of interesting to see a little behind the magic 8-ball.
Look behind the curtain. Good. Luke, something to add?
Also, there's a few other comments that wasn't totally clear that you can actually fish in a potential wind energy area, making sure that was, as a new piece of information folks commented on, and also that the AC-PARS process is one that precedes a rulemaking. The kind of, A-PARS, excuse me, not AC, A-PARS. Yeah.
Sorry, give me that last one again.
Before you can do a fairway or a transit lane, the Coast Guard needs to conduct a port access route study. We happen to conduct one along the Atlantic coast.
Gotcha. Another table.
We can go. We're number 6. We would add a check for the DoD areas. That was a new information and the meaning of the red versus the yellow and how that seems to be different than I think a lot of people initially thought.
Okay.
The timing of the procurement process and the the amount of the high mandates and the amount of procurements that'll be coming out and kind of how how that's changed, the secondary versus primary and how, there's some need, some information shows the need to reduce some of the area and then, how that will, mesh with the procurement process.
Right, so you've got this big procurement number to hit, and yet you've got this, some comments suggesting you winnow, and how do you reconcile that kind of conflicting?
Yes, and how would you, fit that maybe just in the primary?
Great.
Might not be possible. Also, the information about our NIMS surveys in the area and how how those surveys are used for stock assessment and how they could be impacted. Once these areas are constructed.
Right. So the potential to impact NIMS surveys and the accuracy of those. Right?
Yeah, and therefore impact stock assessments, I guess, because they were. And just to clarify, one of the first questions on the fisheries data decline. I know there's a lot for scallop, and it's. I guess I would caution people looking at it as a necessarily decline because there's so many factors that play into where things are. And we should have raised this more. A lot of factors play into where folks are fishing in these areas, and management and access area is a big one. So that may I guess I'm just trying to say it's not that it's a definite decline that's going on in these areas.
Right,
It's
so
kind of not real, shouldn't be read into it that
So
way.
there's difficulty in, you have to be very careful in how you interpret
Yes.
changes
yeah.
in annual catch value, all of that. There's too many other things going on.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that need to be considered and
Great,
caveats on the different types of data. So.
perfect. Is there still another table we're waiting to hear from? Yeah.
I have a microphone too.
you wanna-
So
you wanna put check
reiterating
marks
what's
next to
been
anything?
said. Yes, so the DoD areas, for sure.
Yeah.
We can expand on that and say that changes a lot as far as in the amount of megawattage that can come out of an area if we're talking about smaller turbine machines based on the height. You know, the restrictions, if DoD is going to have site-specific requirements in considering certain areas, there's a lot more information that needs to happen there, and a lot more studies and a lot more assumptions on technology and so forth. So that was one thing that stood out, as well as, again, the NOAA fisheries data. We think that that needs a lot more, I guess, not clarification, but I think it could be definitely binned in a more informative way where we're doing it by section, so by Hudson North, Hudson South, by area, the 4 areas, as well as by taking a regional approach. So rather than doing it state by state, making it, or even port by port, making it more inclusive for a better snapshot of the entire area.
Great. Okay, we're missing one more? Yeah, please.
Sure, we just feel like everything's been pretty covered adequately, especially with the last comment. We also, as a table, thought that it was very helpful to get the DoD perspective and to see the extent of their potential use of the area. But then we also took that one step further and recognized that a lot of the activities that occur in that DoD area made assumptions about the type of wind construction. And so if there's variability in that, in the project development, that could then affect the potential conflict with the DoD activities.
Okay, so sort of questioning some of the underlying assumptions. And depending on where that goes, it would have a very variable impact. Good. Okay, if we've heard from each table, that's great. Let's go to question 2, which is around, so you learned these things, you heard some different perspectives. What changes to the draft wind energy areas would minimize user conflicts while still providing areas that are feasible for development and meeting sort of what we're hearing New York and New Jersey are looking for out of these areas? Who wants to go? Yeah.
So along the lines of the DoD areas, I think we discussed at our table that we wouldn't change anything to the draft wind energy areas yet and let the process continue, but also recognize that some of this data that's going to come out in the coming months is going to inform that process and to help minimize those conflicts. The DoD, the transit lanes, maybe some of the fisheries data that we can pull together quickly. So basically let the process move along.
Great. Sorry, just a quick question for you. When you talked about that, did you at all talk about like how long do you let that process go on for? I mean, was that at all talked about?
Within the BOEM process.
Within the BOEM process.
The same schedule, yes.
Okay, great. Perfect. Another table?
Yeah, I guess we had quite a bit of discussion on this one, but there were some of the issues that we kind of talked about were about the eventual layout of turbines and how that could impact meeting those goals. For example, could the spacing be closer together and then the area could work as sort of a protected area to regenerate fish populations in the surrounding areas if there's not actual fishing in those areas? Also, a re-examination on whether visual impacts analysis is, I guess, removing areas that shouldn't necessarily be removed.
Sorry, say that last one again.
Whether visual impacts are unnecessarily removing areas that could be good in all other regards.
Okay.
So we also talked about the Coast Guard transit lane. The one that's proposed for the new fairway seems to cut through a number of areas identified as primary. So we think that should be revisited. We also discussed.
Sorry, can I ask, when you say revisit those Coast Guard lanes and see if they can be trimmed to not remove those sorry, it's a disembodied voice. So that they're not actually bumping into the primary? Was that the concept?
No, yeah, the primary areas are smack in the middle of these proposed fairway areas. And so we're kind of wondering why that was the case, and if the Coast Guard process seemed to take longer, the time frame for creating those, the new fairways legally seems to take longer than this process of coming up with a lease in the next year. So I think that sort of should come to the top of the reconsideration of making sure that the Coast Guard and BOEM are considering those conflicts.
Okay.
We also had some more consideration for the Hudson South and its adjacentness to the scalp rotational area, the elephant trunk area, is that what it was called? And finally, we proposed that the areas that are right next to the Hudson Valley Canyon, the Hudson Canyon, that valley area leading into the canyon, are too ecologically important to develop there.
So avoid.
Correct.
Sorry, and can I go back to your, this previous one on the Hudson South when you were saying, thinking about the scallop and the scallop fishery and the elephant trunk? What specifically were you all thinking about that?
I think what was raised in one of the previous presentations about perhaps physical oceanography impacts to recruitment in that area, larval distribution, sedimentation.
Okay, so it's about considering the negative impacts, potential negative impacts, is that right? Okay. Okay, great. Another group?
Yes, here in group 2.
Sorry, hang on one second. I have an annoying paper here. Go ahead.
Well, kind of continuing on the comment that we previously made about some of the specifics of the project, we recognize that a lot of these conflicts with users are dependent on the specifics of the project, and so it would actually be useful, particularly with the fishermen, to continue to have an open dialogue and continuous discussions with them, and solicit feedback on their perspective of what can be done to make the uses compatible, which was, I think, already mentioned as far as layout of the turbines and just some of the specifics of how the project might be developed, which is not known at this stage, but could provide a lot of enlightenment as to how to relieve some of the conflicts.
Right, so conflicts inevitably loom larger with all the uncertainty, and as you knew more and you could actually begin to tweak and put some more specifics, maybe you could smart your way past some of these conflicts. Yeah, good. Next table. Anyone have a mic?
Yep.
Yeah.
I do. I'm just looking at my notes and I was going to get some water. I'm sorry, it was parched. So the changes to the areas, learning more about the BOEM prioritization process would probably be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the biggest things we talked about.
Okay.
Oh, and then also understanding the rotational aspect of fishery management plans. And I don't know what exactly that means, but it came up and several people on the table nodded their head.
I'm going to imagine that means, so how do fisheries rotate around different areas, and therefore when you see diminished activity, is it really diminished activity, or is it just because the fishery has been moved to a different area?
Okay.
I think that'd be it.
Perfect.
Okay.
See,
Okay. All right, another table?
Yeah, I can go. We thought that, question number 2 really the answer as far as how it should be modified depends on their perspective. I mean, if you look at it from a fisheries perspective, less of an area would minimize conflict. But if you look at it from a, the procurement standard and what the states are looking to fulfill, then you're looking at a larger area. So we thought perspective was a big one, and that more time would be needed to more analysis to really be able to say what exactly, what should be changed. But with that caveat, we did talk about minimizing some of the traffic separation scheme areas that were raised by New York, I believe, is something that should be looked at again, as well as the fairways. It seems like you would minimize conflict by taking those out. And then we did talk about it, but kind of more along in lines of number 3 of what the table 3 talked about with the proximity to the Hudson Canyon for some of the areas in the Hudson North and information needs, which we're jumping ahead for being able to evaluate how that area maybe need to be modified.
Hudson Canyon.
The area.
Okay.
Area. Or, yeah.
Okay, did we get all the tables on this one? Okay, then lastly, and as additional information needs, and in particular, if there are any that sort of were very immediate near term that you really want to make sure BOEM is thinking about in these next 2 months or so, that would be helpful to know. Yep.
One of the things we discussed is the number that's used is the 0.1 megawatts,
Yep.
but what is a more liberal approach so that we can actually, when we whittle down these areas further, which inevitably will happen, do we still have enough area on the table to meet the state's goals? I mean, I think that's important.
Yep. Great. Another table?
I've got a mic. So we had a few areas again. One was what job opportunities are there surrounding the development of this area? Are there job training opportunities, and could the fishing industry have opportunities to support the wind energy industry? Also, some more questions about cumulative and indirect impacts of the entire installation of everything that would be going in under these plans, and then also
sorry, just on that one, cumulative impacts
of the entire. If everything's kind of put in, what are the cumulative and indirect impacts of installing wind?
Everything New York Bight.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then also some questions about more information on fisheries, if there's forecasting for where fisheries are migrating to in relation to climate change, for example. And is there a better way to present to lay people who aren't fisheries scientists?
Okay, go ahead.
So we talked about the need for more physical oceanography studies and studying the cold pool as well as some of these frontal areas and settlement of larvae and so forth, wake effects, changes to currents. We also discussed some sort of change in the process where there could be conversations before the COP where adjacent developers could have conversations about sort of coordinating their turbine layout, and that would be important for transit and safety. And we also discussed making sure that there's more studies on in determining areas being used by fisheries to consider rotational and fisheries management that's happening at the moment, at the time when these studies were taking place, what regulations were in effect in this certain time frame, and so forth.
So in those backwards look, again, making more sense of those changes.
Correct.
Okay. And can you just repeat the very first one you said, because I think I didn't quite get that.
Sure. So physical oceanography.
Thank you.
The cold pool.
Yep.
currents, fronts, etc.
Great. Okay.
So DoD compatibility, I think that's sort of what necessary mitigations might be necessary in order to have compatibility with those
You
missions.
said DoD, right?
I did.
Okay.
And maybe not so much at this stage, but what information or what restrictions do we need to be aware of to get more, allow fishermen to exercise their fishing rights within a turbine array? Anything else?
We also need to put data on where the fishermen are coming from, and in addition to heat maps of other vessel traffic, but where are the fishermen coming from and where they're going to, so that we can start that transit lane conversation now. Additionally, we looked at some of the tug and tow in the proposed fairway area, and if they're low numbers, can we reach out to the individual owners of those vessels or the pilots to understand their operations a little better?
Right. So if it's a really small population that we're talking about, let's really get granular on this. Okay. Good. Any other tables?
Well, I think these have already been mentioned, but we'll reemphasize them. And it continues on with the theme of some of the other comments that have come from our table, and that is there's a degree of uncertainty as far as the specifics of a project at this stage, which causes a lot of apprehension. So to the extent that at early stages in the process, BOEM can provide specific information about conditions or requirements that will be associated with developing that can allow for resolution of conflicts. I mean, one of the examples that came up was, is there a way at a very early stage in the process for BOEM to identify the minimum distances between turbines and things like that in the layout that would kind of dispel, hopefully, some of the concern about the activities that would be occurring concurrently.
Okay, great. Any other tables left?
I think so. Yeah, so we also had a clarification on the color, the red and maps from the DoD, and questions of related to that and certainty around those the DoD maps.
Sorry, Sue, was the question they're just wanting. You want to hear back from DoD on that?
Yeah, so okay. More, I guess, well, yeah, as far as other information needs is clarification on kind of what that means if they're looking at putting a wind energy site in these, what would consider the red exclusion areas.
Yep, great.
And information, more navigation information, particularly around the aprons for the entrances to the traffic separation schemes. How many vessels are using those areas, because that came up as a question. Also habitat, more information on the cold water pools, the hydrodynamic modeling. I know this was touched upon earlier as well. And impacts of getting that information in the timelines. More, we could certainly do more for fisheries economic information as well. Including the multiplier effect, and trying to understand both, areas, ports and communities that would be both positively or negatively impacted, trying to identify those areas to try and minimize the negative impacts. And also the NIMS trawl surveys, and try and do some more analysis on how these areas overlay with existing strata and survey areas.
Yeah. That here. Okay.
And actually, one more thing, along the lines of what Sue was saying with habitat, species-specific studies, especially for something like black sea bass, vulnerable species.
Great. Great. Good. It sounds like you all jammed a lot into a really short amount of time, so I thank you all for engaging those so thoughtfully. I want to get you to a break, and so we're a little bit behind, so why don't we make this a 10-minute break. We'll reconvene at 4 o'clock, and then we'll hear from some of the developers who are here, and then into sort of next steps. So thank you all very, very much, and we'll reconvene in 10 minutes at sharp.